Hi everybody, in today's episode of Gaffer and Gear, we're going to be taking a look at the different Amaran tubes by Aputure. Okay, so let's start off the review by going over the primary differences between the two types of tubes. All right, so this is the PT series. PT stands for pixel tube, and this is the T series. T stands for tube. All right, so to make sure I don't mix things up in the episode, I'm going to refer to these as the pixel tubes and these as the non-pixel tubes. You'll see why it gets a little bit confusing for me, the names. Okay, so this is actually the PT4C. So the 4 stands for 4 foot and the C stands for color. So you can get these in 1 foot, 2 foot and 4 foot. This is the T4C. So T stands for tube, 4 stands for 4 foot and C stands for color. These are also available in 2 foot. Now, there's only 1 letter difference between the names, so I'm bound to mix them up unless I call this the pixel tube and this the non-pixel tube. All right, so let's go through the primary differences. Well, the pixel tube obviously has pixel effects, whereas the non-pixel tube doesn't. Now, the pixel tube also has a built-in battery. All right, now the non-pixel tube does have battery operation, but the battery is removable from one end. Okay, so you can buy additional batteries, mount them onto the bottom, and operate it that way over battery. So they're the two primary differences. Pixel effects, built-in battery, no pixel effects, and external battery. Now, other differences include the CCT range of the units. The pixel tube has a CCT range from 2700 Kelvin up to 10,000 Kelvin with green magenta correction. The non-pixel tube has a CCT range from 2500 Kelvin up to 7,500 Kelvin with green magenta correction. In terms of other operational differences, the pixel tube has an advanced HSI mode, so that means you can select the base CCT at which you desaturate your light to. Now with the non-pixel version, you can only select the CCT at which you desaturate your colors to over DMX. Okay, so let's go into the pros and cons now, and also the pros and cons that the tubes have over each other. What's the benefit that one tube has over the other tube? All right, the first overwhelming negative for me, and probably a lot of professional gaffers, is these tubes don't have built-in CRMX, lumen radio, or WDMX, and fair enough for the price. But if you want to run these off DMX, and they do run extremely well over DMX, I have to add, you're going to need the adapter cable which connects to the USB port and then to your DMX cables. Of course, this can be messy. Now, a further disadvantage with this, as far as I can see, or a further negative, is it has a USB-C power through. Now, that sort of makes sense because USB-C is going to be the standard going into the future, but at the moment, I don't have any CRMX receivers that run off USB-C, so that means an additional adapter cable and even more mess I've got to try and conceal behind the tubes. Now, as further negatives, neither tube has an IP rating, so they can't be used out in the rain. All right, so let's go over the advantages and disadvantages of the tubes individually. All right, so the pixel tube, we'll start off with that. Now, in its white light mode, in its CCT mode, it's probably not as bright as you're going to anticipate it being. We'll cover that in a little bit more detail in a sec. Now, in terms of the pixel modes, this is a standalone pixel tube. So what I mean by that is you could have, say, 10 or 20 of these in a row, and they could all run an identical pixel effect. But you can't link them together and have a pixel effect going from one tube to another. So if you want to do that over your Sidus Link app, you're going to have to buy InfiniBars. All right, now let's get into the advantage that this has over this unit. All right, so the first difference is the brightness. Now, in terms of the color modes, the brightness is very similar, but when it comes to your CCT or white light mode, the brightness levels out of this totally destroy this tube. Let's take a look. Let's start off looking at 3200 Kelvin. Now, to give you a real world comparison, I also took some readings with a Titan tube. Now, as you can see here, the Amaran T4C comes in at 140% brighter than its pixel tube brother. Now let's take a look at 5600 Kelvin. And it's a pretty similar story. Again, the T4C comes in brighter, but this time by 155%. Now let's take a look at primary red, and this is where things really turn around. The Amaran pixel tube is now the brightest light, but only a little bit brighter than the T4C. But what's interesting here is the Amaran pixel tube is 230% brighter than the Aputure Titan tube. Now let's take a look at primary green. And the PT4C is once again the brightest, but only by a fraction over the T4C. But again, what's interesting here in the color mode is that the Amaran pixel tube is 60% brighter than the Titan. And the results are pretty similar in blue. The Amaran pixel tube is noticeably brighter than the T4C, and about 60% brighter than a Titan tube. Now, the next advantage that the non-pixel tube has over the pixel tube is in terms of color render. The highest color render score I recorded on the pixel tube was a TM30 of 94. The lowest color score I recorded on the non-pixel tube was also 94, and that's only above 6,500 Kelvin. Below 6,500 Kelvin, this thing scores 95s and 96s. Now, in addition to having superior color render, it also has superior color fidelity. So what that means is if you're using it in its white light modes, things like your skin tones, things like shirts and clothing, will be the correct color saturation, where this unit is a little bit off. Now, in addition to that, the non-pixel tube also has better white point accuracy, or delta UV. So both lights have green hue magenta correction, but this one you might need to use it a little bit just to match this light in with your existing Aputure lights. Now let's go over some of the advantages of the battery being removable. So number one is the bulk of the weight is the battery. So if you don't have the battery attached, the light is actually extremely lightweight. So this could come in handy for rigging. Let's say you want to build a softbox over the top of your set and you're thinking about having tubes in it. Well, this might be an advantage, not having the weight of the batteries in that softbox. Now, the other advantage is that you can buy batteries separately. So you don't have to have lots of tubes being on standby in case a battery goes flat. You can just replace the battery. But here is what I think is the biggest advantage of having the battery at one end. Because the bulk of the weight is in the battery, if you are hand holding it from the battery, the bulk of the weight is in your hand. So it is very easy to hold this above a camera or hold it underneath the camera if you're going to be doing handheld work with it. The other advantage you've got with the battery being at this end is if you're using it in, say, a C-stand. It does have a thread at this point, so you could put a spigot in, mount it to the C-stand at the battery end, and the bulk of the weight is now closer to the C-stand, reducing the chances of anything tipping over or sagging. The other advantage that the non-pixel tube has is it has more secure mounting options. You've got a thread at the top, you've got a thread at the bottom of the battery, and on the back you've got 3 threaded points that also have the RE pins. Now, in addition to that, there's a nano rail across the back, and Aputure now have a nano rail spigot. So you can mount this onto the back of the light, position it where you'd like to position it, and then lock it into place. Now, I'm just going to show you a quick tip for helping you mount this to the center of gravity. So with the battery attached, the weight is very much off to one side. So here's a little trick you can do. Place the tube lightly in your hands and bring your hands closer together. The hand which has the least amount of weight on it will slip, and the hand that has the most amount of weight on it will stick. And you will eventually find the center of gravity. So if I wanted to mount that nano pin into the center of gravity, I would mount it at this point. Let's go back to talking about the pixel tube for a moment. And one of my favorite pixel effects is the fire effect. Now, a lot of tubes, the fire effect runs pretty much evenly across the tube, like a fire would if it was horizontal. But you can rotate the fire effect in this from horizontal to vertical. So here I've got it running vertically, and you've got less flicker down the bottom than you do at the top. So it really does feel like there's some height to this fire. I've got less flicker on my body and more flicker at my head, and that would be the case if I had a flame that was this high. So that is a pretty cool feature. Okay, let's go through how much things cost and what you get for your money. So we'll start off with the non-pixel versions first. That's the T series. Okay, so you can get a 2-foot kit. Now they sell in singles. I can't find any doubles or quad kits. Now the single kit sells for $199 and I've seen it listed for 297 Australian dollars. In terms of optional extras that are designed just to fit this, you can get a grid, which is $45 US. We'll cover the other accessories in a second when we do the 4-foot tube. All right, so the 4-foot kit, that sells for $329 US, and I've seen it listed at an average price in Australia at $534. So we'll just go through the kit. You get a power supply, which is also your battery charger. You get your regional power cable with an IEC lead at the other end, which plugs into your charger. You get an eyelet, which you can stick at either end of the tube for rigging. You get a battery. And of course, you get the tube. All right, let's take a look at the tube. The back of the tube is a metal construction. Now the edges of the tube are metal and have threads for mounting. They also have some flattened edges to stop the tube from rolling around and allowing you to position an angle. However, one side doesn't work because the power outlet sticks out further than the flat piece. And the other side doesn't work all that well. Any vibration or movement and the tube will roll onto its back. Now the battery has a very secure locking system. Just twist it and it's locked. To unlock it, press the silver button in and twist it the opposite direction. Plug the cable in and you're ready to turn on. Now there's nothing too flash about the user interface. It's got a simple black and white screen, a roller to select your mode or parameter, and once you've selected your mode or parameter, just press the roller down. To go back one level in the menu system, you can press the back button, or to go back to the menu homepage, you can press the menu button. In terms of operating modes, you've got CCT, HSI, gels. Now the gels library isn't too flash, it's just primary, secondary colors, and CTOs and CTBs. You've got your standard effects. The next item is custom effects, then DMX, frequency set, so you can adjust in 100 Hertz if you're trying to get around rolling shutter issues at high speed. Next is your battery settings. So you can have normal, set it for a 2-hour duration, 4-hour duration, 6-hour duration, 8-hour duration. So this basically reduces the brightness to ensure that you're going to get ample runtime for your setup. Next in the menu is screen on-off time, Bluetooth reset for the phone app. You can change the language, that's always fun. Got factory reset, product info, and exit. Now, in terms of optional extras for this, you can get this 45-degree grid, which sells for $69 US and folds in half for storage. It does a pretty good job. Now, the grid separates at the center, so you just undo the Velcro there, and it folds in half and has a Velcro cable tie at that end, so very easy to store. So that again is $69. Now you can get the clamp, that's $29 US, and that's made of solid metal, and you can also get the DMX cable for the same price. Now additional batteries, $85 US, I've seen them listed for 145 Australian dollars, and these are 5,200 milliamp hour batteries. Okay, now let's have a look at the pixel tubes now. That's the PT series. Now the 1 foot, that's the PT1C, that sells for about 140 US dollars or about 200 Australian dollars. And you can get a grid for it for $19. Now that comes with no DMX cable and no charger in that kit, so that's something to bear in mind. Okay, we have the double kit here. So the double kit sells for about 600 US dollars, about 850 Australian dollars. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's pretty much the same as the 4 foot kit, but I will just show you this. The 2 tubes are packed in on top. And then underneath here, all of the other accessories and bits and pieces. So it is very well packed into the kit. Now let's take a look into the 4-foot kit. Okay, so the tubes are in individual sections in one half of the kit, and in the other half of the kit you've got a lot of pouches there. Okay, so let's start going through the pouches. So you get your 2 chargers or power supplies, so that's their USB-Cs. You get 2 DMX cables. You get 2 of the floor stands. What else have we got in here? You get Allen keys. I don't know what the Allen keys are for. You get 2 of the eyelets, the steel eyelets that go onto the ends. And you get 4 of the clamps that clip onto the lights. Now the clamps have threads for your spigots as well as magnets. Now I'm just going to show you a closer look at these clamps. So the only thing that sort of concerns me with these clamps is there is a little bit of play in them. Okay, and if you were rigging them, say, upside down onto a ceiling, I would be a little bit worried about them coming loose. But there is enough space in here that you could feed something like a cable tie through. So if you're mounting it to a ceiling, I would definitely feed like a cable tie as a secondary source to make sure that the light doesn't come out of the clamp. I think the magnets will do a pretty good job of securing the light and clamp into place. Now, with the exception of the end caps, the whole tube is a plastic construction. Now, from beta testing these tubes, I can tell you that if you stand on them, they crack, but they don't shatter, indicating that they do have some solid structure in there somewhere. Now, the end caps are made from solid metal and are threaded, and they are sold with a thread adapter mounted. The ends of the tube have flat edges to allow you to angle the tube to a desired position. You've got a USB-C port that is for DMX in and out, charging the battery and running it off AC power. When you plug a charger in, you are in no doubt as to whether it's charging or not, and it clearly displays the percentage of charge that's in the battery. If the light is functioning correctly, you'll have a blue light here. If the light is charging, you'll have a red light here. To turn the light on, long press the on button. Now the menu system by default will go to the last mode of operation that you had set. Over here we have our back button and our menu button. To go to the menu system, press the menu button. There are 2 layers of menu. Here we have our operation modes, and if I press the menu again, we go to our background or system settings. If you press it a 3rd time, it'll go to the mode of operation that you're currently running in. Let's go back to the menu. Now to select my mode of operation, I use the up and down arrows and press OK. Red is the option that is currently selected. Let's select our CCT mode by hitting OK. Now the parameters that these buttons operate is highlighted in grey. Now this grey can be very hard to see if there are any reflections on the screen at all. If I toggle up and down using the arrow buttons, you can see I'm changing the parameter that I've got selected. Now to select my intensity here, I hit OK. And you can see the grey box has now shifted to the intensity reading. The intensity is adjustable in 1% increments. And as I adjust the intensity, you can see it adjusting on the light. The same logic applies for the HSI mode, but it does not apply for the effects modes. Let's select Pixel Effect and hit OK. Now I want to select 2 pixel chase, so I'm going to scroll to that and hit OK. Now at the moment, the intensity is set to 0. So I select my intensity and dial that up. But I have no brightness running through the tube yet because I haven't hit OK. So in the effects modes, you have to hit the OK button in order for the parameter setting that you've put in to take effect. This can be very confusing. For example, you can have a fire effect that is not in motion. Despite dialing in speed, you might not have hit the enter button and it is still running at 0. Now let's take a look at the second menu. We can adjust our Bluetooth settings and our DMX settings. Let's take a look at the DMX settings. You have the usual DMX options of DMX address, DMX profile, and DMX loss of behavior. Let's go back in the menu. And you also have your system settings. You can select your language, screensaver, product info, and do a factory reset. Now, I almost forgot to mention that the optional grids also work with the PT tubes. Okay, now let's get into the DMX testing, and just a reminder that you need the USB to DMX cable adapter in order to do this. It is sold with the Pixel tubes as standard, but it is not sold with the non-Pixel tube, so just remember that. Now, in addition to this, the DMX profiles on the Pixel tubes, you've got CCT. Now at this point I got thoroughly confused and messed it all up, so just read the list, but the important thing to note here is these are all 8-bit profiles. There are no 16-bit profiles. Okay, let's start the testing. I have the Aputure T4C tube, that's the non-pixel tube, running off an 8-bit CCT HSI crossover profile, and it is receiving its commands via an external CRMX receiver. In the middle I have the Aputure PT4C tube, that's the pixel tube, also running off a CCT HSI crossover profile, 8-bit, and it is receiving its DMX commands via an external CRMX receiver. Now to give you something to compare the response times to, I have an Aputure Titan tube, which is also running in an 8-bit CCT HSI crossover profile, and it is receiving its commands via an internal CRMX receiver. All 3 lights will be receiving their commands at the same time. Let's start off with instant on-off commands. Now let's have a look at some half-second cues. Now let's have a look at some 1-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 2.5-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 5-second cues. Now let's have a look at some CCT changeovers between 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin, starting with instant changeovers. Now let's do some half-second changeovers. Now let's do some 1-second changeovers. Now some 2.5-second changeovers. And now for some 5-second changeovers. Now let's have a look at some cues changing over from white light to a colour hue. And this is where things get interesting. The Aputure T4C, that's the non-pixel tube, seems to be a bit behind when switching over to a colour mode. And the Aputure Titan seems to be the opposite. When going from a coloured light back to white light, it seems to do a slow transition rather than an instant changeover. Whereas the Aputure Pixel Tube, the PT4C in the middle, seems to be able to do everything on cue. Let's take a look. Now let's have a look at some half-second crossovers. Now the Aputure tubes seem to be running to a linear crossover, whereas the Titan tubes seem to be a bit slow on the transition to start with, and then ramp up towards the end. Let's take a look. Now let's have a look at a 1-second cue. Now let's take a look at a 2.5-second cue. Now let's take a look at a 5-second cue. Okay, let's start going over the data I've collected on the T4C, starting off with the average CCT accuracies. Between 2500 Kelvin and 3000 Kelvin, the light is typically accurate to plus or minus 14 Kelvin. Between 3100 to 4000 Kelvin, the light is typically out by minus 6 Kelvin. Between 4100 to 5000 Kelvin, the light is off the target value by an average of minus 68 Kelvin, and between 5100 to 6000 Kelvin, that jumps to an average of minus 132 Kelvin. Now let's take a look at the light's white point placement measured in delta UV. Between 2500 Kelvin and 3000 Kelvin, it has an average delta UV of plus 0.0002. Between 3100 Kelvin and 4000 Kelvin, it has an average delta UV of plus 0.0010. Between 4100 Kelvin and 5000 Kelvin, it has an average delta UV of plus 0.0013, and between 5100 to 6000 Kelvin, it is splitting between the Planckian curve and the daylight curve with an average delta UV of plus 0.0018. Now let's have a look at the color render results measured in TM30RF. Between 2500 Kelvin and 3300 Kelvin, the light scores are 96. From 3400 Kelvin up to 6000 Kelvin, the light scores are 95. Let's take a close look now at some of the kelvins on the T4C, starting off with the lowest kelvin that we can dial in. When I dialed in 2500 Kelvin, I got 2518. The TM30 colour render results were 96% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R11 is below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point was very accurate with a delta UV of plus 0.0002. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3193 with an SSI score of 85. The TN30 colour render results were 96% average colour accuracy with an average 103% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R11 was below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point was very accurate with a delta UV of plus 0.0006. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4355. The TN30 colour render results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 103% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores. R9, R11 and R12 are below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0015, which would make the light at this point ever so slightly green, but to well under the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5476 with an SSI score of 74. The TN30 colour render results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 103% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point comes in with a delta UV of plus 0.0017, which places the white point almost perfectly split between the Planckian curve and the daylight curve. When I dialed in the top Kelvin of 7500, I got 7105. The TN30 colour render results were 94% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0018. So without any correction at this point, the light would be slightly green to just under the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Now let's look at how accurately the T4C can dial in its colour vectors. Red, which should be 0 degrees, came in at 1 degree. Green, which should be 120 degrees, came in at 118 degrees. Blue was smack on at 240 degrees. Yellow, which should be 60 degrees, came in at 76 degrees. However, I'd recommend dialing in 44 if you want a decent looking yellow. Cyan, which should be 180 degrees, came in at 196 degrees. And magenta, which should be 300 degrees, came in at 272 degrees. Now let's start going through the data I've collected on the pixel tube, the Amaran PT4C, starting off with the average CCT accuracies. Between 2700 to 4000 Kelvin, the light is off the target value by an average of 52 Kelvin. Between 4100 to 5000 Kelvin, it is typically out by plus 48 Kelvin. Between 5100 to 6000 Kelvin, the light is typically out by minus 27 Kelvin. And from 6100 Kelvin to 7000 Kelvin, the light is typically out by minus 92 Kelvin. Now let's take a look at the white point placement measured in delta UV. Between 2700 to 4000 Kelvin, the light is averaging plus 0.0015 delta UV. Between 4100 to 5000 Kelvin, it is averaging a plus 0.0021 delta UV. Between 5100 to 6000 Kelvin, it is averaging a plus 0.0024 delta UV. And from 6100 Kelvin to 7000 Kelvin, it is averaging plus 0.0034 delta UV. Now let's have a look at the colour render results measured in TM30RF. At its lowest Kelvin of 2700, it comes in with a 92, and by 2900 Kelvin, that has gone up to 94. Between 2900 Kelvin and 3300 Kelvin, it comes in with a 94. Between 3400 Kelvin and 4300 Kelvin, it scores a 93. Between 4400 Kelvin and 5400 Kelvin, it scores a 94. From 5500 Kelvin to 6200 Kelvin, it scores a 93. And then from 6300 Kelvin to 6700 Kelvin, it scores a 92. Now let's take a closer look at some of the kelvins on the pixel tubes, starting off with the lowest CCT that we can dial in. When I dialed in 2700 Kelvin, I got 2732. The TN30 colour render results came in with a 92% colour accuracy and an average 96% colour saturation. But take a close look at the circle here, because this is where averages can be a bit misleading. All of the CRI scores are plus 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0038, which would make the light at this point, with no color correction, green to the equivalent of almost a 1/4 correction gel. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3244, with an SSI score of 86. The TM30 colour render results were 94% average colour accuracy with an average 100% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R11 and R12 were both under 90, but only just. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point was fairly accurate with a delta UV of plus 0.0009. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4457. The TM30 colour render results were 93% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 and R12 were below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0021, which would make the light at this point, without any correction dialed in, slightly green to the equivalent of almost a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5579 with an SSI score of 75. The TM30 colour render results were 93% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores, R9 and R12 are below 90. And the white point comes in with a delta UV of plus 0.0020, which places the white point fairly split between the Planckian curve and the daylight curve. When I dialed in the top Kelvin of 10,000, I got 9,585. The TM30 colour render results were 85% colour accuracy with a 97% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores, and with the exception of 5 of them, the rest are below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the light is still tracking reasonably well to the Planckian curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0017. Let's take a look at how accurately the pixel tubes can dial in a colour vector. Red, which should be 0 degrees, came in at 1 degree. Green was smack on at 120 degrees. Blue was smack on at 240 degrees. Yellow, which should be 60 degrees, came in at 48 degrees. Cyan, which should be 180, came in at 202. And magenta, which should be 300 degrees, came in at 290. Well, that's another episode of Gaffer and Gear done. Don't forget to click like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next episode. Take care.